I think we can point to a lot of positives in the UK, whether that's sort of the amount of venture capital that's invested. I think collectively we raised more in the UK last year than France and Germany combined. What can entrepreneurs offer in providing things? Kind of thinking about the NHS would be a critical one. So many different kind of health tech businesses out there. I'm sure there are plenty that could be doing a great job of providing kind of novel and innovative solutions to whether that's preventative or reactive kind of treatments to really help people improve their health and reduce the burden on the NHS. As I said, that kind of requires different things. Maybe it requires a culture change. Maybe it requires a bit more of a focus on allowing SMEs to bid in.
It's often said that entrepreneurs are the backbone of Britain's economy, and yet we haven't heard too much lately about how we can help ensure that our smallest and most successful businesses continue to flourish, with so many other issues from inflation through to the healthcare, education. How we ensure the basics are gotten right still seems to be an open question. Welcome back to the IEA podcast. My name is Lesh. I'm the IEA's Director of Public Policy and Communications. Each week, this podcast asks a tantalizing policy question. Today's question: how can Britain become more entrepreneurial? To discuss, I'm excited to be joined by Eamonn Ives, the Head of Research at the Entrepreneurs Network, previously a Government Special Advisor, a researcher at the Centre for Policy Studies, and a regular media contributor in writing and broadcast. Welcome to the podcast, Eamonn.
Thank you, Matthew. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start at the top. Why do you think entrepreneurs actually matter?
Yeah, I think entrepreneurs matter for a real range of different reasons. First and foremost, startups are a critical source of new job creation in the economy. Very often, startups, particularly the most innovative ones, are really working at the cutting edge of sort of science and technology, and they're responsible for a lot of the solutions that we'll have for challenges, things like climate change or an aging society. And I think entrepreneurship is important for another reason as well, in that a lot of the people who go into entrepreneurship, often the reason they do that is because they might not necessarily flourish to their full potential in what we might term the traditional economy. There's many other reasons as well, but I'd sort of pick those out as the top three.
I wonder what you might say to, an entrepreneurship skeptic, someone who's not quite certain that entrepreneurs are the center of everything. Maybe they'll say something like most new ventures end up failing, that it's a bunch of people who seeking funding for things that aren't going to necessarily work out, that those kind of problems that you're talking about should really be for the government to solve, not for private enterprise.
I think it's a valid concern. And to be sure, there's a lot of variation within the entrepreneurship community. But I think that's kind of an inherent part of it. To a large extent, you're taking kind of bets. These companies are taking bets on something that might be risky. It might not work out. And I don't think we should necessarily admonish that. Because I think the general idea is that, out of those, 99 companies might fail, but one might succeed, and that one might create such a disproportionate amount of value to society that it actually, that's where you get the results. And that's maybe one of the thesis behind why entrepreneurship matters.
How do you think Britain's going when it comes to entrepreneurship?
I think it's going very well, actually, and contrast to some of the more kind of doom and gloom we often hear about the economy. I think the UK can really point to a lot of success over kind of the last 10, 15, even 20 years or so. Certainly since the sort of financial crisis, I think we've really established ourselves as a great place to start a business. There are some questions about whether we're doing quite as well as we are when it comes to scaling those businesses. But certainly compared to a lot of the European economies, I think we can point to a lot of positives in the UK, whether that's sort of the amount of venture capital that's invested. I think collectively we raised more in the UK last year than France and Germany combined. Clearly, we're kind of a long way behind the likes of America and China, but I think that's kind of a different question, really. So I think there's a lot of positives for the UK on this front.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think Britain is more successful than France and Germany and much of continental Europe?
It's a great question. I think a lot of it comes down to a lot of the kind of the existing strengths that the UK had, whether that was in its sort of finance landscape, so a lot of kind of money on offer to invest in, as I was saying before, often quite risky ventures that we kind of want to come off. Other strengths you might look to are immigration system, which I think has broadly been quite open and welcoming for talent. Our university sector, we've clearly got some excellent universities producing wonderful research, and a lot of the times when we're looking at those most innovative companies, that's coming straight from the universities and commercializing that research. So I think the UK already had quite a lot of underlying strengths, and it's really the story of the last kind of 10 to 15 years is looking at how we can mobilize and capitalize those strengths.
I suppose an interesting question, as you've said, the UK has done quite well with entrepreneurs in the last 10 to 15 years, but as I'm sure you'd also acknowledge, the UK economy in general hasn't done very well. We haven't seen the kind of productivity improvements, we haven't seen wage increases, the per capita GDP growth has been extremely weak. What do you think explains that? Is there, at the micro level, you could say entrepreneurs are doing really well, but at a macro level, the UK economy is quite weak. Is therefore the entrepreneurs not actually making that much of a macro impact?
I mean, yeah, it's a real kind of paradox, I guess. And if I knew the answer, maybe I'd be a bit further along in my career than I am. But yeah, I mean, I guess maybe one thing you could say is that if it weren't for the contribution of entrepreneurs in this country, maybe we'd be even further behind than we might be. So yeah, it's a real sort of thorny issue, and one that I'm sure there's kind of all sorts of different explanations for. I think anyone trying to sell kind of one single coherent thesis is maybe you have to look upon that quite skeptically. But yeah, sure, it's a very challenging sort of policy question that I think we all need to think quite seriously about.
I do sometimes wonder if it's something to do with the ways at least some kind of innovative entrepreneurial activity won't necessarily get captured in high GDP statistics. Perhaps the best example of this will be free online services, or free for users. The amount of income that's bringing to you is pretty low. The amount of people they actually employ is pretty low in the scheme of things, but it doesn't mean that the quality of life hasn't been improved as a result of those services.
Definitely, I think that sounds quite a compelling argument, I think. And I guess kind of one of the things that we see with a lot of kind of entrepreneurship is that the sort of the positive spillovers of the kind of the products or the services that they're creating probably aren't getting captured as well as we might want in kind of raw productivity data or things like that. And that kind of speaks to the fact that a lot of the sort of founders and entrepreneurs creating these startups, they're often very motivated by kind of creating that kind of social value, improving on how kind of society can function, whether that's things like ride-sharing apps or other things in kind of the sharing economy, often kind of motivated by that idea that we want to kind of create a better economy, and that doesn't necessarily get captured in the raw data.
Somewhere I do, though, worry about, I suppose, British entrepreneurship or claims made about British entrepreneurship is the extent to which a lot of it potentially might come out of government subsidies. So there are various programs the government introduces where they try to give startups some amount of a grant to get them going. The reason I worry about that is because if you can't get private financing for some kind of a venture and you become state dependent, are you really creating significant value, or are you just kind of sucking on other broader resources in the economy? I'm wondering whether you've had much thought about that, and is that something to worry about? So we say, there's a huge number of startups, but they're not really leading to anything because they're not really productive businesses. Sure.
No, I think it's a perfectly valid question, and certainly one whenever we're talking about taxpayer money, you kind of want to make sure you're getting the best returns on that, and whether it's the sort of thing we should be subsidizing. I guess my kind of caveat on that is that a lot of the kind of the work that startups are doing is really based upon the idea that there's that what they're doing is quite innovative, that they're probably creating a lot of social value, and that therefore there's an argument that requires the government to kind of step in, whether that's kind of early stage R&D. And clearly there are lots of different ways the government can step in. It could step in by giving tax relief. It could step in by giving direct grants. And even when we're talking about grants, maybe that's kind of, there are different ways of doing that. I mean, I think one of the most exciting things we've seen lately is the establishment of ARIA, this new kind of agency, sort of arm's length body that the UK government really aimed at funding that kind of very speculative, high risk but high reward innovation. So I think with things like that, I think there's very much a case for government getting involved. Perhaps there's not so much on some of the other stuff, But I think to kind of tar it with all one brush is not necessarily the most kind of sophisticated analysis that we should be doing. And yeah, you probably want to dig down into the more kind of granular level to kind of work out what we should and should not be doing.
I mean, I won't dwell on it too much. I do have some skepticisms about Aria, more around whether or not we overrate the value of a kind of state outfit trying to pick what are the most innovative possible products and companies and investments, and whether or not that's, because there have been some successes in the past that the people can point to, whether that's really the right way to achieve R&D outcomes. But I don't want to dwell on that too much. I think it's probably worth talking more about what can be done to, I suppose, improve the entrepreneurial environment. And you wrote a recent really fascinating report on this for the Entrepreneurs Network called Building Blocks, Our Vision for Securing Britain's Entrepreneurial Future. The first issue you talk about, I think it's what people might not necessarily associate it initially with Britain being more entrepreneurial, but is one that's absolutely essential and potentially undiscussed, which is this question of agglomeration effects. What do we mean by agglomeration, and why do you think that matters?
Yeah, I think it's coming back to the report we wrote. Yeah, we wanted to really take kind of a very fundamental look at where the economy is perhaps going wrong, and what the fundamentals of a productive economy are, and one that supports entrepreneurs. And yes, maybe kind of looking at those areas that you don't necessarily immediately associate. You might think of venture capital and things like that. But we want to take a kind of another look. And yeah, I think we stumbled upon sort of agglomeration as being one of the key factors that underpins entrepreneurial and productive economies. And what that basically means, for anyone who doesn't know, is agglomeration sort of refers to the idea that getting companies close to each other is a way to boost the economy. Maybe they're kind of sharing ideas, they're collaborating more, they're maybe working on problems together. There are other advantages of kind of just having more people in a densely concentrated environment, whether you can kind of share infrastructure, sort of physical or digital. So a whole different reasons why agglomeration matters. But we've known about this for literally centuries. Adam Smith talked about this in The Wealth of Nations, that when you have kind of deeper, more concentrated labour markets, that's where productivity fundamentally can come from. And I think to the extent that the UK has agglomeration, I think we certainly have pockets of it. London stands out as one of the most agglomerated places in the world, and that shows up in the productivity data. Other places like Manchester or Birmingham or Leeds, I think there's a very good argument that they are under-agglomerated, particularly when we look across the channel to our sort of friends in Europe. A lot of that kind of second-tier cities do a lot better than the UK kind of equivalents. So thinking about how we can crack that puzzle, and I don't know if we'll come onto this, but sort of thinking about building more houses, allowing people to live more closely together, improving transport infrastructure, so you allow those kind of connections and sort of serendipitous interactions between people to happen a lot more easily. Things like that are absolutely vital, and I think we kind of take it for granted, whether kind of in our daily working lives, if you work miles and miles away from some of your colleagues, you're probably not going to be as effective at producing value than you would be if you were close together. But we seem to have kind of lost sight of that at the kind of the national scale. So hopefully this report we did is kind of a bit of a corrective to that analysis.
I think it's an interesting shift in terms of the way people were thinking, even just a few years ago, midway through COVID, where it was more or less decided that people didn't really need to be physically close to each other anymore in order to be productive. We could all just work from home remotely. In fact, many of us do take at least some of the week working remotely. But yet the kind of demand to live in cities definitely dropped for a short period of time in 2020, but I think it has very much come roaring back. And despite the power of technology, the perception still, and I think you emphasize this in your report, is just physically people coming together. There's a sort of magic that happens. And there's some classic studies that show that when people are in the same office buildings as each other, they tend to be more productive because there's just that chance of bumping into each other in a larger building, in a larger space. Obviously, sometimes you need to manufacture those connections. They won't necessarily all happen naturally, but the potential for something to happen is only possible when people are physically close to each other.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more, and that's essentially what we sort of say in the report.
I'm wondering how you think that interrelates to some of the government's discourse, though, about levelling up. Because we've heard a lot recently in the last few years about the need to help left behind areas. It's not usually perceived that means agglomeration into cities. Do you think there's a bit of a tension there?
I think there can be. I don't think there has to be. But I think kind of in practice, we've kind of got ourselves into a place where it almost certainly is. Yeah.
So the centre of cities versus the centre for towns. Kind of.
I'm not going to get into. I'm not going to start slagging off other think tanks, but yeah, I think that the sort of the debate is kind of we kind of get onto that level. I think kind of the idea that we want to level up is good. And speaking as someone who's born and spent the first part of my life in Manchester, I'd love to see kind of more opportunities for wealth creation outside of kind of London and the Southeast. And I think there's kind of, as I say, you kind of get into a bit of a tension, and sometimes you get let down sort of certain policy paths where perhaps that's not necessarily going to be the most effective way. And I think kind of looking at what's kind of happened since this kind of levelling up phrase first started getting bandied around, I really don't think I've seen much at all that suggests we're kind of on the right track. Now, that being said, I don't think that kind of invalidates the whole sort of initiative. I just think it means taking a slightly different view. So as I kind of said before, simply building more houses, building better transport infrastructure, things like that are perfectly and eminently possible to do, and would benefit places like Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Newcastle, wherever you want to kind of think about. But it's kind of a case of doing that and looking for ways to be doing that. So, we know that we've got a housing shortage, and that's kind of created through various different things, not least our archaic planning system. So just kind of allowing people to kind of create those incentives to build up, densify cities and streets in a way that's kind of going to have that public support. I think solutions like that are really going to be critical to really restoring these kind of left behind areas, as we talked about.
Yeah, I think there's probably a good case here to make that it shouldn't be seen as in competition with each other, that London and the Southeast doing well doesn't mean that other parts of the country actually do poorly. And just because Manchester does a bit better doesn't mean that the towns around Manchester have to do any worse. In fact, quite the opposite. The way it should work, if there is some proper agglomeration going on, is you should be able to connect into the cities where there is inevitably going to be more economic activity, and to some extent give people the opportunity, no matter where they are, to I suppose level up themselves as much as their place. So I think you can make quite a strong argument that one of the problems UK has is that people are left in places that don't necessarily have much of an economic logic, and that keeps down the wages and means people are stuck in places where there isn't that much opportunity, and then you get the associated social ills. I think it's probably a very different way of thinking about leveling up, to connect all that together. But it's certainly probably a more economically effective way to actually raise people's quality of life and see them as working together rather than working against each other.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering, moving on to another issue that you talk about quite extensively, which is the classic one of tax. The general issue, I think everyone is suffering from at the moment to some extent, but you could say especially anyone who wants to start up a business, is the fact that we're seeing a growing tax burden. And if there's one thing an entrepreneur knows that they're potentially going to face is that tax burden. And as it goes up, it becomes a bit less of an incentive for whether investing in a company or starting up a company. What can be done to ensure that we encourage more entrepreneurship through the tax system?
Yeah, so I don't think there's any question that the burden of tax is going up, and that is having a dragging effect on growth. I think we need to think about why the tax burden is going up, and generally that's because we've seen some pretty thorny challenges of late, whether that was COVID and then the ensuing kind of energy crisis. And I guess kind of to come back to our report, what we didn't necessarily want to get into is sort of a simplistic debate about high and low tax. What we wanted to kind of sketch out is what would a more rational tax system look like. So we kind of focus on the idea of a simple tax system and a neutral tax system. And really looking at what can be done to remove perhaps taxes that are such drags on growth, things like stamp duty, But then also thinking about, that's going to have a cost in and of itself. And I think it's silly to kind of think that we shouldn't think about how that shortfall could be made up. Of course, some of that shortfall might be made up through improved economic growth, but I do still think it's kind of incumbent upon policymakers, and I'm sure all the Treasury ministers listening to this will agree with me, that you've got to kind of think how you make up that shortfall elsewhere. So whether that's kind of looking at things like consumption taxes, increasing those, or taxes for other sort of negative externalities in the country. But I also just kind of wanted to talk about why we have such growing tax burden at the moment, and what might be driving the tax burden in the future. I think entrepreneurs play a critical role in doing things that can hopefully bring that tax burden down, or bring the necessity for that tax burden down. So whether that's kind of developing solutions that we can utilize in our healthcare systems. I think there's so many wonderful entrepreneurs out there that we talk to on an almost daily basis that have kind of solutions that the NHS should be procuring, and we can talk about how that process can be made easier and better for entrepreneurs, or entrepreneurs kind of coming up with solutions in a whole manner of other things that can really help bring down the cost of public services, and therefore hopefully the amount of tax that we all need to be paying every month.
I think there's this interesting question about, there's effectively two questions here. One is the tax burden too high? And you can say yes, it is. Although if we want a certain level of public service delivery, it kind of has to be at a certain height, particularly in the context of an aging population. And then the secondary question of what is the cost of squeezing tax revenue? What is the extent of the deadweight costs, and ways in which the tax system can be simpler and better, and require less effort and disruption. I suppose the main ones, obviously, that always come up here, and rightfully so, stamp duty, land tax, the particular taxes at different levels of income, that marginal rates, they're very high, particularly as you increase your income and you have child care rebates at the same time, real disincentives to work, as well as other questions I suppose you could have around whether or not we're taxing, let's say full expensing has already been achieved, but it doesn't include buildings at the moment. So should full expensing also be extended to buildings? Obviously, there's some level of immediate cost to changing that, but the return on investment would be relatively high compared to what I think the government does tend to do when they have a little bit of extra tax revenue lately, is just take 1p off income tax, which is nice, but it's not necessarily going to have as huge an impact on the economy as some of the other changes.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And one of the things we say in the report is that, clearly this can't be something that a single budget fixes. I think any chancellor that tries to do that will find themselves swiftly marched out of number 11. So thinking about, what could, over the course of a parliament, over the course of two parliaments, how do we kind of get from where we are at the moment to where we might want to be in the future, a much more rational tax system. And hopefully we offer a few ideas or kind of general principles more than anything. We're not sort of necessarily looking at specific taxes per se, but just kind of presenting that this is what sort of a more coherent tax system in the round will look like.
The next topic, which you also are quite interested in, is this question that I suppose not all entrepreneurship is innovative, but a lot of entrepreneurship certainly is innovative and tries to enter new fields and new sectors. What can the government do to kind of, I suppose, encourage that innovation?
So I'm going to pick on our university sector. So we wrote another paper last year, actually looking at spin-outs. Now, spin-outs are companies that basically commercialize the research that's undertaken at universities. I think the UK can proudly claim to be doing quite a good job there. And certainly we can boast, or we can point to some companies that have come out of our universities that are real world beaters. Now, last year, the government kind of looked into this question, and we were writing a paper at the same time. So it was very fortuitous for us, timing-wise at least. And basically, we kind of did a very big kind of evidence review of how sort of spin-outs work and sort of the process of spin-outs. And to simplify extremely, basically the UK takes a lot more, UK universities generally take a lot more an equity stake in spin-outs during that process, in return for kind of the support that they offer. And I think it's kind of right that they should get some stake, but perhaps not the levels that we see at the moment. Whereas in some American universities, they generally do it the other way around. They take a small stake, sure, but they kind of wait for the company to scale up, really achieve its full growth potential. And then I guess kind of the idea is that then they reap the rewards later down the line. Now that clearly kind of requires quite a radical rethink, but we think it's kind of one that's worth going for. So we argued that kind of university academics should be able to retain full ownership of their IP that they produce. And we think that's a better way to incentivize them to really do something with the research they're doing and get it out of the laboratory and into kind of the real world that people can benefit from. And so, yeah, that's kind of one in many things I talk about on innovation.
Intrigued by that, is that a legal requirement, or is it more kind of like a contractual requirement between when you go work at a university, you just sign away the IP rights to anything that you develop, and the universities basically need to have a different offering for their staff?
Yeah, so generally the university would kind of take ownership of that, and they have these things called TTOs, tech transfer offices, which will help academics to maybe patent or commercialize or link them up with people in the business world. But I think that kind of, as I was saying, and this is simplifying to a certain degree, but generally kind of this idea that we've kind of got this the wrong way around in the UK, and it's something that Jeremy Hunt really took an interest in and has driven through some thinking on this. And hopefully we are now beginning to see kind of this situation changing. But it really required sort of the investor community, the entrepreneur community, those kind of particularly entrepreneurial academics to really come forward and say this. And hopefully our paper made kind of a little difference at the margin as well. But
I'm sure it did. I'm sure it did. I mean, on a slightly different note, though, I'm interested in the role of regulation. This is something obviously we talk quite a lot at the IEA about, both the quantity of regulation that an entrepreneur, particularly in a kind of innovative space, might face, as well as the nature of regulators themselves, that you can't necessarily get the approvals that you need in the time that would be required to ensure that your activity is even possible in the first place. I mean, there's some classic examples here that we've done some research on over the years, things like e-scooters that are outlawed due to centuries-old regulations, and then the government's very slow to allow them and only allows them in limited trials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have kind of, at the other end of things, you have cultivated meat and food innovations, where the UK has this opportunity after Brexit to potentially have a more welcoming approach to novel foods, but hasn't taken up that offer as it currently stands. I'm wondering, what role do you think regulation, and how much do you hear from entrepreneurs that you speak to about regulation as an issue?
I mean, regulation is absolutely critical. If you legally can't sell something, then you don't have a product to sell, and you can't be an entrepreneur. You mentioned cultivated meat, and that was the first option I was going to go for. I think there's kind of a general agreement that the Food Standards Agency, has kind of missed the boat to a certain degree. And I'm not saying that's necessarily their fault. I know that they're kind of criminally understaffed when you think about the opportunity that's on hand here. And I'm not normally the first to kind of call for ever more regulators. But I think that kind of we have to accept that there are these sectors of the economy where, whether we like it or not, there is kind of that demand for regulation and consumer protection. And if that is the case, then let's adequately resource our regulators, allow them to do their jobs, and then hopefully we can kind of get ahead of some of these markets. Places like Singapore, Israel, the US, they're moving a lot quicker on these kind of very novel and innovative sort of sectors, cultivated meats and things like that being one. And I think there's the danger that sort of the UK-based startups, they are looking abroad because they want to be able to kind of get their products out there and test them and establish that kind of sales record. And the UK's risks falling behind if we don't kind of do something quite quickly. And this can be seen in all different areas as well. You mentioned sort of novel transport solutions like e-scooters, but I guess you'd also think about drones and things like that. Artificial intelligence is obviously kind of a huge one, a bit of the elephant in the room. But I think kind of crafting those regulatory frameworks and not kind of leaving it all vague and maybe up to the courts to decide kind of what is and isn't permitted. That's what government should be doing, and creating those kind of regulatory structures so entrepreneurs know where they stand. So investors know where they stand as well. They don't want to be cutting checks for businesses that they've then, a couple of months down the line, the government turns around and says, oh, well, we're not going to allow you to do this. So I think just kind of having that certainty really counts for a lot. And it's something that, a lot of entrepreneurs we talk to are very keen to talk about themselves.
I'm intrigued when you think about the idea that sometimes floats around about basically new innovative products being able to just pay a bit extra to the regulators, but then expect kind of a guaranteed response time that you effectively make the regulated pay for the additional effort that might be required, if such an effort is required. I mean, I know the Free Standards Agency has been talking quite a lot about being under-resourced. I'm not entirely I'm sure they have plenty of other things to do, but there's always a question in my mind about whether or not there's a productivity question or issue there as much as there is a under-resourcing issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of take these things on a case-by-case basis, and sure. Now, to your point about kind of fast tracking, I think that's a very interesting idea. Certainly one that I think we've kind of talked about a little bit in the past, don't see why we shouldn't be kind of looking at these things. If I want to apply for a passport, I can do that on a kind of a fast track basis. Nobody seems to have any problem with that. Why can't we kind of be doing it for these products as well? I think it seems like a no-brainer to me.
Yeah. Another issue that you might be, I see you kind of talk about as well, it's not really thought about in the entrepreneurial space perhaps as much should be, which is around public procurement and the potential role for ensuring that's opened up in a way that is available to entrepreneurs. What does that possibly mean?
So procurement can be an extremely kind of lucrative way for entrepreneurs to set themselves up and establish kind of a firm pipeline contracts or whatever it might be that they're kind of selling into government. I think generally there's kind of been this idea that government's not brilliant for procuring from smaller, perhaps more innovative businesses, and arguably the taxpayer loses out from that. And you can kind of understand why. If you're a decision maker in government, you're probably going to be quite risk averse. So I think it kind of requires a culture change more than anything, that civil servants should feel empowered to, whether it's at the central or local government level, to look out there and see what's out there. What can entrepreneurs offer in providing things? Kind of thinking about the NHS would be a critical one. So many different kind of health tech businesses out there. I'm sure there are plenty that could be doing a great job of providing kind of novel and innovative solutions to whether that's preventative or reactive kind of treatments to really help people improve their health and reduce the burden on the NHS. As I said, that kind of requires different things. Maybe it requires a culture change. Maybe it requires a bit more of a focus on allowing SMEs to bid in. But I don't think necessarily big companies have covered themselves in glory when it comes to fulfilling government contracts. And to its credit, I do think kind of over successive years, the government or various governments that we've had over the last 10 years have kind of tried to do this. Maybe we could argue they used to be doing a little bit better, but they certainly have brought forward legislation to allow more procurement to go to sort of smaller, more innovative companies.
Yeah, I think there's some crazy rule that people talk about that you can't use past failure as a reason to not procure from a company, which seems like the opposite logic of what you might want. Sometimes it is actually good to discriminate someone if you know that they're discriminate against someone if you know that they're incompetent. So that is a justifiable reason. Let's get on to the final kind of major section that you think to talk about, which is the role of labour and skills. I suppose it's attracting the right people with the right talents to the right roles. What does that mean?
Yes. I think kind of it's a cliche to say that the economy is built on the people it's made up of, but it's a cliche for a good reason. I guess kind of when we look at this, one of the paramount things for us is immigration. And that's, enabling and allowing talented people to come from outside the UK into the UK to contribute to our economy. Previous research we'd done suggested that 39% of the 100 fastest growing companies in the UK had at least one foreign-born founder. So clearly they have a disproportionate role in the sort of startup economy that go on to create those successful and lucrative businesses. And I think there are plenty of different ways and visa pathways that we can look at to enable those kind of talented individuals to come into the UK while still being kind of sensitive to public concerns about kind of higher immigration.
I think there is absolutely a bit of tension here, at least with the current political discourse, where a lot of smaller companies, in fact, I think I saw the Entrepreneurs Network wrote a letter with the Startup Coalition recently, highlighting that some of the new rules might make it quite difficult to hire in the talent that these companies need to be able to expand. Now, I'm sure if you did a general survey and you said, do you think a startup should be able to hire a programmer, most people would say yes, but why do you think that might become more difficult?
So I think clearly immigration is, it's risen back up the charts as a key issue for the public. And I think anyone sort of interested in effective policy change has to take that seriously. But I think where we kind of land on a lot of the policies we call for, it's really about sort of, targeting those especially highly talented people, maybe people who've already set up businesses, and looking for how we can help them come into the country and employ people in the domestic economy, pay taxes, all this good stuff that we might want to have as a growing and flourishing and dynamic economy. So one of the policies that we've called for lately is looking at building upon really the success of a visa pathway we have called the High Potential Individual Visa. This allows people who've graduated from top universities in the last 5 years, I think it is, to come into the country for 2 years, work and contribute to the economy. Now, the way that the visa sort of methodology is working out what those universities are is kind of good, but it's not great. And we think there are other metrics that we could draw upon. Maybe that's including kind of business schools. Maybe it's including kind of niche technical colleges that nonetheless produce extremely talented graduates, but they might not necessarily show up in the current methodology. So just things like that. And I don't think we need to necessarily kind of fling the door open to a crazy degree. It's just about kind of looking at, these are people which surely we want to come into this country and contribute, and just making that process easier for them. At the moment, we seem to sort of have got it into our heads that we want to bring down immigration, and therefore we need to kind of make every single route as hard as possible for people to pursue. I don't really think that kind of resonates with the public at large, and actually we can have quite a sensible and constructive debate on this without closing the door to those extremely talented people.
It seems a question of being selective need not be the same as pulling up the drawbridge in its entirety. Well, Eamonn Ives from the Entrepreneurship Network, thank you so much for joining the IA podcast. It's been a fascinating and a quite wide-ranging discussion. If you are enjoying the podcast, please do subscribe on your chosen podcast provider. And if you'd like to learn more about the IEA's work, just visit iea.org.uk.